Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Jeff Potts, who is Vice President of Sales at BluJay Solutions. And today we're going to talk about the future of freight procurement. Now, we're in the fourth quarter of 2017, and a lot of companies are in the process of putting together and finalizing their budgets for 2018. And I think it's safe to say that when it comes to transportation, all signs point to, tighter capacity and higher rates, moving forward here in the weeks and months ahead. So how should, shippers, approach freight procurement moving forward? What are some of the big changes or trends, they're going to be impacting the process, and how can technology help? Those are some of the questions that we're going to, address here today. And, Jeff, I've known Jeff for a long time, and he's, has a wealth of experience in the transportation industry, and obviously in his role there at BluJay Solutions, he's on the front lines of, working with shippers and carriers and all the stakeholders in the industry, and has a front seat view in terms of what's going on. So it's great to have him on the program. So Jeff, welcome back.
Thanks, Adrian. It's great to be with you again, and look forward to our conversation today.
Great. So Jeff, I guess, as a way to get started, let's talk about the current state of the transportation market. I mean, there's a lot of discussion today about tightening capacity and rising rates, as I said. I mean, what are you seeing, based on the activities on your network and the shippers and carriers that you work with?
Sure. Yeah. And as you know, we are at BluJay Solutions, what we call a single instance multi-tenant SaaS platform. So we aggregate in excess of $17 billion of annual freight spend through our TMS technology. And we just recently ran the numbers for the last 6 months. And what we're seeing is over the last 6 months, rates have increased by 22% across the board for shippers in the marketplace. Dry van's been a little bit lower. They've been around 19% rate increases or cost increases, and refrigerator's been more in the 27%. Interesting enough, since August 20, when Hurricane Harvey hit, about half of those increases have come up since then. So about a 12% increase since August 20. And again, the breakdown on the dry van's been around 11% rate increases since then, and 14% on the refrigerated side. We've also seen a pretty significant increase in loads going to the spot market, and there's been about a 17% premium being paid for loads in the spot market over traditional contracted rate that the shipper may have on file with a particular carrier.
Well, I mean, those are some significant percentage increases. I mean, it sounds like is it accurate to say that, the hurricane Harvey kind of exacerbated, the problem or the rise in rates and tightening capacity, but it was happening nonetheless anyway?
Yeah, and I would say that's true. I mean, obviously the economy continues to chug along, and manufacturing indexes are all up, and the economy's in good shape, and so that in and of itself has tightened capacity. You're going into the third and fourth quarter, which historically are big times of the year for kind of year-end holiday sales and that type of thing. And then the hurricanes on top of that kind of exacerbated that whole problem in terms of getting equipment and networks out of balance and that type of thing. So it's been kind of a perfect storm, if you will, of what's been going on in our last few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that term "perfect storm." I mean, the last time that we were really talking about this, I remember was back in 2004. Right. Where tight capacity, rates were going up. The driver shortage issue, which is kind of an ongoing kind of problem there. So what I heard recently at the CSCMP conference, I know you were there as well. I know my conversations with shippers and things that I was just hearing is that everyone's kind of looking at the cloud, looking out their window, look at the clouds darkening and saying, it looks like we're heading into another storm here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think everybody's trying to figure out, okay, is this short-term, long-term? How does this impact our supply chains? And what do we got to do differently to try to mitigate some of these issues?
Right. So again, I guess along those lines then, I mean, do you see, particularly relative to, let's say, the last time that the industry found itself in kind of a perfect storm. Are shippers in a better position today to weather the storm than in the past? And kind of what's new and different today?
Yeah, I think that definitely shippers are better in a better position. One of the things that, like with our customers today, they certainly have access to what is the real-time market rates. So we have, the freight index, what we call BluJay, built directly into the TMS, so they can see, okay, if market rates are going up or I'm experiencing increases, how am I compared to the marketplace? And so, they have a better information on kind of benchmarking themselves versus their peers. That's, real-time market intelligence. They also have better tools embedded in the TMS as to, how do I efficiently, if my primary carriers aren't turning or turning the loads down, to get those loads covered through spot markets and that type of thing. So there's tools like that. And one of the things that we've done here in the last year as well, we've partnered with Uber Freight. In fact, you mentioned CSCMP. We had a joint presentation out there with them and really talking about this partnership. And what's interesting about what they're doing is, a lot of companies view them as a traditional broker, but they're really bringing a lot of the same kind of technology that they brought to the taxi industry to the commercial transportation industry. So being able to have drivers download an app and be able to get real-time visibility into loads available, what those loads pay, and so really putting the tools in the hands of the drivers in a new and meaningful way for those drivers. And if you look at the marketplace, I mean, there's, as we all know, it's a fragmented marketplace. There's over 470,000 carriers, but only 10% of the carriers, or roughly 1/3 of the capacity, is with fleets that are larger than 6 trucks. And so many of our shippers are using, the medium and large size fleets, but there's a long tail of smaller private owner operators that there's really no efficient way for carriers to have access to. And so one of the things that they bring to the marketplace for our clients is access to that long tail of capacity that historically they haven't been able to go after in an efficient way. And so it's really trying to take the friction out of the system and introduce capacity in the marketplace that they historically haven't been able to work with.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You bring up kind of the long tail. That was something that I've talked about over the past year from a different context. Mainly from a supply chain visibility standpoint, where companies historically kind of follow that 80-20 rule, right? They would do 80% of their transactions or visibility with the 20% of their suppliers. They had accounted for that 80%, but they're recognizing today that they need now that visibility to that long tail, right? To the other 80% of their suppliers that they're doing business with. And it sounds here it's kind of a similar type of thing on the transportation side, where as the capacity gets tighter, the need and the importance of really reaching those long tail carriers in an efficient way is going to become more important.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's no question about it. I think that's going to be increasingly important as the market continues to be tight and rates increase.
So, just, in terms of what Uber Freight is doing, I mean, obviously with all the regulations that are in place, ELDs and hours of service and safety requirements and the like, I would assume that there's almost like a broker. I would say that there's some sort of certification that needs to take place so that you as a shipper feel confident that the carriers that you're working with have met your requirements versus relative to insurance, safety, and so forth.
Right. Yeah. And so in that way, Uber is a broker. So so they're still having to vet those carriers and make sure there's insurance and that type of thing, like a traditional broker would do. But I think the how they access those carriers and those drivers, really getting down to the driver level, is different and unique in terms of the technology that they're bringing to bear to access that long tail.
Great. So let's talk about the freight procurement process now. Kind of in a lot of everything that we've talked about. I mean, how should shippers and carriers approach freight procurement in the weeks and months ahead?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, even before you kind of get into procurement, I think it's always good for, the shippers and the carriers to continue to, maintain, a regular cadence of meetings to really look at, what's happening with my business, where's my business going from a forecasting perspective, what are changes in my network, what are changes in the carrier's network, how do we make sure that we're working together as efficiently as possible, reviewing the KPIs, what's on-time performance been looking like, what's your tender acceptance looking like, and that type of thing, to make sure that the carriers and the shippers are working together as efficiently as possible. I think specifically as it relates to procurement, it's important to maintain that regular cadence of procurement because let's face it, carriers networks do change over time, the shippers networks change over time, and it's important to maintain that regular cadence of procurement events. I think it's also important to look at your strategic carriers before you go out to a procurement event. And membership should have its privileges if you're a carrier that's performing well for a shipper, and looking at that carrier's network and saying, okay, are there places where we can make sure that we're helping support our strategic carriers that are really performing well for us and supporting them, and maybe there's carve outs even before you do a procurement event with those carriers to make sure that you're leveraging their network and utilizing their assets as efficiently as possible.
Now, are you seeing the cadence change at all? I mean, do most shippers and carriers still go out and kind of do like a once a year type of refresh of their contracts and rating guide? Do you see that maybe particularly maybe with those that might be more strategic, doing that perhaps longer term, or kind of changing the process from the way that it's been historically done?
I think the cadence hasn't changed, and I think shippers are realizing as well right now, in spite of the market conditions, whether they go out to market or don't go out to market, they're experiencing increases in their transportation costs. So I think a lot of shippers recognize it's still important to maintain that cadence. It's important to really work with our carriers and look at the networks. And I think it's important for those commitments to be honored on both sides, both on the shipper side as well as the carrier side. So if I'm a shipper, am I honoring my commitments that I made to those carriers in terms of the lanes and the capacity and that type of thing? But then also on the carrier side, it's important, particularly in these market conditions, that they're maintaining their side of the partnership as well, and not necessarily aggravating the situation with price increases because they can get away with it, so to speak, right now in the marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, I know, historically, some of the challenges or the shortfalls have been where, shippers either didn't provide the carriers with enough granularity or visibility in terms of what their demand is going to be in the weeks and months ahead, right? So
Right.
I think one of the leading practices I've seen historically would be, shippers that are able to really get down into on a lane by lane basis and really forecast out in terms of what they expect our capacity needs to be. And then to, continuously modify as they continuously modify and change that, because obviously we all know that forecasts are always wrong, but to keep the carriers, to your earlier point, maintain that ongoing communication to kind of share with the carriers, okay, here's what we thought we were going to do at the beginning of the year. We're now in month 3 and things are either ahead of schedule or behind schedule. We're going to experience more demand or less demand. And I think working through the continuous communication, I think has been a successful, approach in the past.
Right. No, absolutely.
So let's talk about the role of technology now. I mean, certainly TMS, transportation management systems, play an important role here. There are other technologies that you talked about, benchmarking and having access to real-time visibility to what's happening in the marketplace. I mean, how is technology in general, helping shippers and carriers, approach freight procurement, more, intelligently and efficiently?
Yeah, you had mentioned the benchmarking. And typically, when we're involved with procurement events with our clients, that's the first thing we do is really look at their rates and what they're paying in the marketplace today, comparing that to the rate index that we have in the TMS, and then saying, okay, should you go out to market with your entire network? Should you potentially carve out only certain lanes where you're potentially above premium by a certain percentage on the lanes? So that's the first step. But then secondly is really looking at our network, and that's one of the beauties of the model that we've created is when you have over 20,000 carriers in the network, and it's roughly about $17-18 billion of freight flowing through the network on an annualized basis, really looking at where is their complementary capacity. So where are carriers consistently moving freight in complementary but opposite directions to that shipper? So one thing we never want to do is steal carrier capacity from shipper A to give it to shipper to B, but we always want to look at the network and say, where do we see carriers moving in opposite directions to that particular shipper, and then make sure that those carriers are being invited to a procurement event. Because at the end of the day, it's all about asset utilization. If you can find the right carrier on the lane that it results for lower empty miles for that carrier, higher utilization of the equipment, ultimately it's going to yield a more aggressive rate for or attractive rate, I should say, for that shipper, and create a better sustainable solution for that carrier. And so that's kind of the secret sauce, if you will, when we go out to do procurement events on behalf of our customers, is really looking at the complementary nature of the market.
Along those lines, I mean, are you seeing, or participating in or helping to facilitate, collaborative, shipping opportunities where you have enough density and enough repetition, if you will, of these lanes to, come in, two shippers coming in, let's say together to, approach a carrier and say, hey, we can make this almost like a dedicated, lane here. Are you seeing more of that or more opportunities like that coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. So we not only look at it from the carrier side and say, where's their, complementary carrier capacity going in the opposite direction, but we also look at that on the shipper side. So where do, shipper A and shipper B have very complementary lanes where you can go to the marketplace and work with carriers more on a dedicated continuous move type of an arrangement, and result in savings for both shippers, as well as create that continuous move for the carriers. And so, that whole concept of what we like to call green lanes, it's really leveraging the network and the information exhaust coming out of the network to drive that next level of efficiencies that are beyond four walls of everybody's individual supply chain.
Yeah, no, I think there's some great opportunities there. Historically, a lot of companies, there've been many challenges, to do that. I think culturally and just because of change management, type of issues. But I'm one of these firm believers that moving forward, the only way that companies are going to get to that next level of performance and reliability and so forth is that those barriers to collaboration, have to start coming down, and that's going to be the real way that companies are going to get to that next level of performance and cost improvement. And obviously, the technology piece, being part of a network and having that visibility to that data helps, to facilitate that.
Right. No, absolutely.
So, Jeff, we're running short on time here, so I just got a couple of more questions. And I know making predictions is always a risky business, especially here in, when we talk about, transportation. But how do you see the future of freight procurement evolving over the next few years? I mean, what big changes, will we see?
Yeah, I think, we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. I think the fact, there's a couple of things. One, I think that some of the new tools that give you better real-time intelligence around visibility into demand and capacity really allows you to more efficiently execute. And you talked earlier about, sometimes the vagaries of forecasting are less than stellar in terms of the forecast. So if you have better visibility into what's going on in a real-time capacity and demand perspective, it allows you to execute better. Planning becomes less important. So I think that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing, and we talked about this in a previous episode of what's going on with autonomous vehicles. I think that's going to fundamentally change the landscape as well. That technology is continuing to evolve and develop very, very rapidly. And as you start to be able to see and envision a world where capacity is running 24/7, 365, that I think will fundamentally change how shippers use routing guides as an example, and that type of thing. Utilization of equipment will drive down costs overall because of the efficiencies that are gained and higher asset utilization and that type of thing. So I think that's going to continue to help offset some of these pending wins that we have in the marketplace today.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think there's ongoing debate in terms of how near that future is. Whether we're a few years away or a decade or more, away. And but I think that ultimately some form of autonomous vehicles will play a role here. And certainly, I think to your point, is going to have an impact in terms of how shippers and carriers work together, and how that kind of capacity is procured and reserved. You can always see a day where we're procuring drones or procuring space on a hyperloop tube, or those are all things that arguably perhaps are a little bit further down, but you never know, right?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of new and exciting technologies that are out there.
Absolutely. So, Jeff, as a way to kind of wrap up, I mean, if I'm a transportation executive at a manufacturing or retail company, I mean, what should I be communicating today to upper management in terms of what to expect with regards to to transportation in the weeks and months ahead, and then what action should I start taking today?
Yeah, I think you need to kind of get out ahead of it a little bit, and so I think transportation rates, in the fourth quarter and on into 2018 are going to continue to rise, whether we like it or not. I think that's the environment that we're in right now. And so I think, transportation executives, supply chain executives really need to make sure they're communicating well inside their organization on what's happening, making sure they're giving their senior management good analytics on what's happening with costs and that type of thing. Nobody likes surprises. And it's better to be able to get out in front of it and be able to communicate what's going on. And then hopefully through that communication, organizations can continue to look at, what are the things that we can do as a company to break down maybe silos within our own organization around, inefficiencies and that type of thing in order to make ourselves a better shipper out in the marketplace. And I think it's also very critical for those supply chain executives to continue to have those regular ongoing cadence of meetings with their carrier partners and really looking at what are the metrics, how are we doing collectively, what's working well, and also as importantly, what's not working well, and then what are the things that we can do to address those areas of opportunity to to mitigate those things. And so I think it's, communication, is probably vitally important going into this time right now, to make sure that you're communicating well within your organization, but also with your carrier partners as well.
Yeah, I think that's solid advice there, and I think that's proven to be successful in the past, and I think it's going to be even more critically important moving forward here. Well, Jeff, like I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always just manage to scratch the surface on these topics. And with everything going on in transportation, I mean, we probably could have spent 2 hours talking about all different aspects of what's happening in the industry. But certainly we provided some good food for thought and addressed some of the key things that are happening right now. And And, I think you provide some good advice for folks in terms of what to communicate and what actions to take in the days ahead. So, again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Absolutely. Yeah, great talking to you again, Adrian, and thanks again for hosting it.
Great. Thank you for joining us today. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the BluJay Solutions website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Jeff, you can post it there, and I'm sure that he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.